my key topic that really interested me throughout the tour was the policy pressures that were in place at each of the different countries that we visited, in particular Indonesia, Indonesia policy and government, and how much of an impact that has on Australia, and also in particular the northern beef industry in Australia. So to set a bit of an agenda for the presentation, and to ask a bit of a question to stimulate some thought. So Indonesia is Australia's largest feeder cattle market at the moment, but for how long? So within this preso, I'll go through and just highlight a little bit of an Indonesian market snapshot, and kind of the forecast for their beef consumption in particular I'll be focusing on in the future, the trade relationship that we have with Indonesia and why they're so important to Australia, but also why we're so important to them at the moment as well. And then I'll dive a little bit into the main focus of the presentation, which will be the policy pressures that we observed over there and how they're impacting the Australian beef industry. And this kind of revolved a lot around their goals to be self-sufficient, particularly in the agricultural space, as well as there was a lot of other policies just shaping their market access, as well as, you know, introducing new competitors into the market, as well as strengthening their trade relationships with other markets as well. So it was very much a global trade game that was going on, that was quite evident. And then finally, some contingency planning or just food for thought or further investigation as to what we can do in Australia to ensure that we reduce our risk exposure to Indonesia itself, but also the global, I suppose, the live export industry and also just the global trade in general. So I suppose moving on to my first topic, just a snapshot of the Indonesian market. So Indonesia, one thing that came out of it, Indonesia is an extremely strong economy. So they had a GDP growth of 5% in 2024, and their new administration that got elected last year is aiming for a target growth of 8% annually, and that was a big part of their campaign. They're the 16th largest economy globally, and they're the largest in Southeast Asia, and they're the second fastest growing in the G20. So they've got an extremely fast growing economy, and that's driven by a very big population. So they've got 281 million people, and they're the fourth most populous country in the world. And although they've got a steady kind of population growth of 0.82%, which was in 2024, 0.82% of 281 million people is still a lot. So this leads to the whole kind of relation to beef and food and agriculture, and there's just going to be a very large demand for agriculture and the beef consumption in the future. So beef consumption per capita is forecast to grow at 1.2% annually through to 2029. Their domestic production only covers about 65% of this demand at the moment, and within the 65%, they've actually got an ongoing reliance on imported feeder cattle from Australia. So there's very much an integrated system that we run with Indonesia. We breed a lot of the feeder cattle that feeds into their, I suppose, feedlot market, and then they finish them and feed them and then sell them into their wet markets. And I just added a few visuals there, but I think a key one that highlights just this increased demand for beef is that one on the bottom right, which is from MLA, which just signifies the beef imports into Indonesia over the past 10 years. And as you can see, it's a pretty significant increasing trend through to 2022. It has dropped off in the past years, but on average, beef imports and beef consumption in Indonesia is rising. So moving on to the trade relationship we have with them. So, and why we're so important to them and why they are so important to us. So we supply 49% of Indonesia's boxed beef. Well, that was in 2024. Australia is the sole supplier of live cattle at the moment. However, within this presentation, I'll highlight how Brazil and New Zealand are flagged as future potential competitors, and 30% of all Indonesians' total beef consumption is sourced from Australia. So they are extremely important to us as well. So they were our fifth largest market for Australian boxed beef in 2024. They were significantly lower than the top four. However, they still were a very big market. And they're by far our largest live export destination, taking in 63% of our total live exports in 2024 as well. So one area I wanted to focus on here in terms of risk exposure was the northern beef industry, particularly the Northern Territory. So 70% of the live export cattle originate from Northern Australia, and in the Northern Territory alone, 46% of cattle that were sold were live exported, and only 54% were sold or sent interstate. So you can see that there is quite, and I suppose I've put some more visuals there. The bottom right corner just illustrates Indonesia, that we sold 473,000 head in terms of live export last year, which valued at 465 million. The next kind of competitors are significantly lower: Vietnam, China, and Israel. So there is a very large dependence of Indonesia as a market in the Northern Australian beef industry and in the Northern Territory. So moving on to, I suppose, the main topic of the presentation that I found really interesting was just policy pressures and how the government and the market can shift overnight with an introduction of a policy, with a change of government, with a global competitor coming in, threatening our market access and stuff like that. And I thought a good quote that I found just through reading through articles for this presentation was by Richard Slaney, who was an ex-Elders Indonesian trade veteran. He said, Indonesian policy is what really drives the market for Australian cattle. So within this prezzo, I'll just go through some of the key themes that I identified, which was a lot of that policy around self-sufficiency goals. So trying to be self-sufficient in agriculture and the beef space, the affordability policies they put in place to protect their consumers, to allow them to afford, low-cost beef and low-cost protein, and the trade controls. And that's more so the trade game they play with Brazil, with China, with India, and the quotas that they imply on certain people to strengthen their trade relationships and strengthen their, I suppose, position in global trade. So self-sufficiency goals. A good little quote was from President Prabowo. He got elected in last year, and in his election speech, he said, "We must achieve food security in the shortest possible time. There is no other way." So they actually have a goal of achieving national food self-sufficiency within 4 to 5 years. And that was a big part of his campaign. So some of the policies that were in place that evidently had a big impact on the Australian beef industry was the breeder requirements. So this policy has actually been in place for a fairly long time. It dates back to maybe 2016, 17. I have to look into that. But they've maintained it throughout the years, and it's kind of dropped off during COVID and come back in. But all live cattle importers must allocate 3% of their feedlot capacity to breeding females. And this is just trying to stimulate their domestic herd, grow their domestic herd to reduce the reliance of live imports. So AAM, we run a joint venture over there. The feedlot that we, I suppose, do business with is importing breeder cattle at the moment. Consolidated Pastoral Company is another importer from Australia that operates over there. They're having to do the same in order to maintain sending cattle over there and selling into those markets. So boxed beef importers are also subject to this breeder obligations, although the details are a little bit different, and I haven't included them in this PowerPoint. But some other policies that they've put in place was some land allocation initiatives. So they had I just read in, they had a development of 10,000 hectare integrated cattle project in East Sumba in partnership with Brazil. And that I've just highlighted Brazil there because it'll come into play in the next slide as the global competition that keeps putting their foot in the door, trying to, nudge their way into the market. And they also had another plan to reallocate 3 million hectares of farmland for food and livestock production. And once again, this was had a lot of support from China, who's helping them provide the genetics for their rice pastures to try and achieve rice self-sufficiency. And once again, that's all about China trying to strengthen their relationship with Indonesia, as they can see them as quite a rising economy. So another one was the import permit adjustment. So in 2025, the live cattle import permits, which is essentially just how many cattle importers are allowed to, take from other nations for domestic consumption, they were initially cut from 650,000, which was in 2024, to 350,000 head, so almost half. And that was, all about trying to push that domestic herd, support domestic producers and breeders and stuff like that. That's actually later been revised to 534,000 head very recently. I think it was in the past couple of weeks. However, just the fact that they're reducing these import permits is signaling a push for a greater domestic supply of cattle, which this President Prabowo and the government's really striving to achieve. So some other policies that are shaping our market access is there's some welfare programs at the moment, as well as price controls. So a few of the other guys mentioned the beef price cap at the wet markets, which was really interesting. So beef at the wet markets is capped at 120,000 to 130,000 IDR a kilo, which is about $11.50 to $12.50 AUD. And this is all about maintaining affordability for their consumers. So if you think about it, I put a little bit of a graph up there that I thought might be relevant. It's just the Indonesian Australian inflation rate over the past few years. As you can see, Indonesia's been quite significantly lower than Australia. If they're able to, maintain that price cap at $11.50 to $12.50 in the wet markets, all you can see is just going to continue to push pressure on the feedlotters to maintain their production costs so they can't increase. And then that way they want to make sure that then they're buying cattle, those prices are increasing as well. So it flows all the way down the supply chain. And this ultimately is going to affect Australia. So if the price of the consumer is not going to change, we can't expect to exceed a sale price from Australia to Indonesia change much as well. And as you know, in Australia, the inflation rate inflation continues to occur, production costs continue to increase, and it might get to the point where we get squeezed out of the market in the northern beef industry. So some other policies that are in place there that they had were the free school meals program. So by 2029, they're targeting 82 million free meals to school students as well as pregnant women, I believe. And this is all about ensuring that everyone or key people have, access to nutritious meals all the time. Although this doesn't include beef, I just thought this was a really interesting one, as Brazil plans to export 100,000 dairy cattle to support this program and supply milk into these programs. And that's all about strengthening their trade positioning and getting their foot in the door. So I've included a little bit of a picture on the bottom right from Beef Central, which says Brazil looks to end Australia's monopoly on the cattle exports to Indonesia. So in the future, there's been they've done some initiatives at the moment trying to export feeder cattle from Brazil. And they had a few restrictions around health status and some of the regulations around, I can't remember what disease it was, but there was some reasonings that they couldn't come over. I think it was FMD free, might have been, but they couldn't come to Indonesia, but they've recently got clearance for all that. And they're proposing to send some feeder cattle to Indonesia to compete with Australia in that live export market space. And they're putting initiatives forward, such as these dairy cattle, to support their initiatives to try and strengthen their bilateral ties with Indonesia to ensure they get market access. Some other ones was import control of boxed beef. So they have an 180,000 tonne frozen beef quota in 2025 for boxed beef imports. However, something to note here is that 55% of this was allocated to state-owned enterprises or government-owned enterprises. So when we kind of dug into this a little bit more, it was evident that Indonesia has got a significant trade surplus with India. So they sell a lot of palm oil and coal to India. So they've got a strong initiative to politically favour Indian buffalo meat in terms of their boxed beef imports to strengthen those trade relationships and to ensure they can continue to send other commodities to India. So the graph I showed at the beginning just illustrated the increase in beef imports in Indonesia over the past 10 years. And within that graph, you could see in the past, 5 years, Indian buffalo meat has just increased into Indonesia and become a significant competitor to Australia's boxed beef. It has decreased a little bit in the past few years. However, India now supplies roughly 37% of their beef imports, and Australia roughly supplies 49%. So our dominance is very much under pressure, and it all comes back to this global game of strengthening trade relationships. There's a lot behind these policies that might not directly be influenced by the beef industry itself. It might be another industry, them trying to achieve a better relationship to sell another commodity over there, so favouring a particular commodity coming in. So that is kind of what opened my eyes, is how much of an influence government and policy can have on a market just overnight or just like that. And ultimately, it just affects all of Australian producers. So it kind of also highlighted the need for us, who is so heavily reliant on our export market in our agricultural industry and in the beef industry, for contingency planning and diversification to ensure we don't expose ourselves to significant risk. So a core insight was Indonesia's shifting policy landscape and rising competition exposes Northern Australia's live export dependence. So once again, I'm just restating some facts that 70% of Australia's live export cattle come from Northern Australia. as well as this, I thought I'd just throw in there that the live sheep export ban is meant to be in place in 2028, and this adds urgency to contingency planning because live export industry just by itself is under pressure. So some further investigation for Australians to look into, or northern beef producers to look into, is continuing to increase intensive cropping in the north. So it's already increasing and feeding in the north. So we don't have this kind of isolated supply chain of us breeding all these feeder cattle and then sending them somewhere else to be finished and processed. We can kind of vertically create a supply chain within the north. We can grow our own crops, our own commodities, our own kind of backgrounding pasture lands, feed them and be a bit more intensive in the north so we can finish them, process them, and then use our, I suppose, accreditation, our great image of clean green Australian beef and export it as box products for whatever that might be, whether it be in the domestic market as well. So increasing our intensive cropping and feeding in Northern Australia. Another one is potentially enhancing our southern transport corridors down to backgrounding and finishing land in southeast Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, where we do a lot of finishing and backgrounding in that end of the supply chain. And it also highlighted that we needed to start diversifying our live export market. So as I said, 63% of our live export went to Indonesia last year. Vietnam, China, and Israel were our next largest market. So maybe going over there, trying to strengthen some of our trade relationships with them to reduce that kind of exposure to Indonesia. But the one that kind of hit home the most was we need to continue to strengthen our bilateral ties with Indonesia. As I stated at the start, they are a very, very strong and fast-growing economy. The demand for agriculture and beef and lamb or any protein source over there is going to significantly increase as well with their population, with their economy. So it is a very, very big market and a very beneficial market to be a part of. We are geographically advantaged being so close to them. So we need to put initiatives towards to support their breeder goal, for example. I know Consolidated Pastoral Company have already sent some dairy cattle over there to support those free meal programs. The Australian government needs to continue to strengthen those bilateral ties so that we can continue to export all agricultural product for that matter into the Indonesian market, as they are going to continue to increase in demand in these products in the future. So yeah, that was kind of my key takeaway and something I found really interesting whilst traveling through all the different countries, but Indonesia in particular, is just how much global trade and politics plays in market access and what happens at the on-ground level in Australia as well. So thank you very much to, firstly, Kieran Smith for organising the trip. It was honestly a trip I'll never forget. Got so many great insights out of it. Saw everything from the start of supply chain through to the end of supply chain. And yeah, very, very grateful to be a part of it. And thanks to all the great people I was able to do it with, as well as ICMJ, AMPC and MLA for organising and funding the trip as well. I had